Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our C2ES webinar today on the status and update of RGGI and the lessons learned on cap and trade. I'm Janet Peace, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy and Business Strategy here at C2ES. As a climate policy think tank, we really have been a long-time supporter of market-based policy mechanisms like cap and trade. Ask any economist like myself, and they'll tell you that cap and trade stimulates investment, innovation, in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And most will also tell you it's the most cost-effective way to reach a specific level of emissions reduction goal. In the United States, we have 11 states, but there are a lot of other jurisdictions outside the United States that have cap and trade market-based policy programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Here in the US, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, also affectionately known as RGGI, was the first market-based policy program directed specifically at carbon dioxide emissions in the power sector. Established in 2005, RGGI was expected to help states reduce annual power sector carbon dioxide emissions by 45% below 2005 levels by 2020. We thought this webinar would be particularly timely because RGGI states recently updated their model rule so that they could reduce emissions by an additional 30% from 2020 to 2030. And it's also particularly relevant because Virginia, not part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, Virginia has proposed a cap and trade program similar to RGGI. And potentially it could be linked to this program beginning in 2020. So we know there's a lot of interest in this topic. We know there's a lot of interest in what a post-2020 carbon market would look like in the Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic regions. So today's webinar, we're going to summarize how the program has been updated, what particular elements of the program has been changed, and we're going to particularly focus on how RGGI has benefited the region, and how Virginia's draft proposal may or may not align with RGGI, and what's next for compliance in that state. And then finally, we've been doing this for a while. So we're going to also talk about what are the lessons learned from cap and trade. So for those of you not familiar with C2ES, and I assume most of you are since you're logging into our webinar, but just in case, we're a not-for-profit, nonpartisan think tank who tries to bring together diverse interests to come up with practical solutions. We really think it's vital for states and cities and businesses to work together, maybe now more than ever, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to deploy clean energy, and prepare for the impacts of climate change that we really can't avoid any longer. We're, again, particularly happy to be doing this webinar about RGGI today. RGGI has shown that you can both grow the economy and reduce emissions at the same time. Over the program's lifetime, states have seen over $2 billion in economic benefits. That's pretty terrific, isn't it? So today's speakers are going to give you that kind of background, and we're really fortunate to be joined by three really exceptional speakers. The first is Ben Grumbles, who is the Secretary of Maryland's Department of Environment. His duties include, among other things, serving as the chair of RGGI. Ben had previously served as the president of the U.S. Water Alliance, EPA Assistant Administrator for Water, Senior Staffer and Counsel for Transportation and Infrastructure and the Science Committees in the U.S. Congress. And he's going to tell us about the changes to RGGI, and where the program's heading. We're also joined by Michael Dowd, who's the Director of Air and Renewable Energy Division at Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. Michael oversees the air quality planning, permitting, compliance, monitoring, as well as a small renewable energy permit by rule program for the Commonwealth. Prior to becoming the air director, Mr. Dowd served as DEQ's enforcement director. And he's going to give us an overview of the Commonwealth's proposed program and how could be or may not be aligned with RGGI. And closing, last but not least, we had Dr. Rob Stavins. And Rob is the A.J. Meyer Professor of Energy and Economic Development at Harvard's Kennedy School, where he's the director also of the Environmental Economics Program and the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements. Rob is one of the foremost experts on cap and trade, and he and I authored a paper, well, it's been a couple of years now, on the case for cap and trade. he really is kind of at the forefront of thinking about the design and the implications of cap and trade. He's looked at a pretty diverse area of environmental economics and appeared in more than 100 articles in academic journals, popular periodicals, and a dozen books. We're really pleased to have all three of these speakers, and I think you're going to find them very insightful and helpful as you think about how RGGI is being updated and how Virginia is coming forward with cap and trade, and really what do we know as a whole about cap and trade. So we have a lot of folks on the line today, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions. My goal for this webinar is to ensure that there's enough time at the end to do question and answers for all of our speakers. But if you have any, really pertinent or clarifying questions for each speaker, feel free to use the chat button as part of the webinar, and we'll see if we can fit those in. Otherwise, we'll make sure that we address those at the end of the webinar. Also want to let you know that we're recording this webinar, and if the technology all works out, we're going to make the recording and the slides available on our website. You'll also notice on the webinar, whatever that thing is called, the GoToWebinar little gray box on your screen, that there is a little place for handouts. And so we have a couple of handouts that you can download. We'll also be putting the slides there that you can look at, in addition to being able to come back to our website at a later date. So at this point, Ben, how about if I turn it over to you?
Thank you, Janet. Oh, what an honor it is to be part of this lineup here to talk about the most important topic of RGGI and where we go from here. Again, I'm Ben Grumbles, Maryland Secretary of the Environment, but honored to serve as the chair of RGGI right now. I also just want to give a shout out to Andrew McKeon, the Executive Director of RGGI. Now, let me also mention some late breaking news, and that is that on January 26th, RGGI will be having a stakeholder webinar. To find out more information about the webinar, it'll be on Friday, January 26th from 12:30 to 3 p.m. But to get more information on it and to register, go to our website, which is RGGI.org. And we'll be getting perspectives and views from stakeholders on Virginia's potential participation in the RGGI market, as well as some of our latest economic analysis. So if you turn to the slides, the next slide, please. Thank you. Many people are aware of the geography and the makeup of RGGI. I just simply want to say, like Janet did, that it's essentially a cap and invest program to reduce CO2 emissions from power plants. 9 states are currently participating in it. What makes RGGI a cap and invest program is that most carbon allowances are sold at auction, and the participating states invest the proceeds from those auctions into energy efficiency, renewable energy, bill payment assistance, and other programs that reduce emissions and benefit consumers. Compliance began in 2009, and as Janet made a reference at the beginning, the regional auctions have raised $2.8 billion for state investments to date, and that's something to be proud of. And since the program began, RGGI states have reduced emissions more rapidly than the rest of the country while experiencing faster economic growth. So if you could go to the next slide. What I really want to share with listeners and participants in the webinar today is the exciting developments that occurred over the last several months after over a year of intense discussions among the participants in RGGI, the members of the board, the agency heads, environmental and economic regulators for the states. We found consensus in moving forward in extending the RGGI program through 2030 and strengthening the overall program. Now, I list, and you're looking at 4 major elements, and all of those were integral to us achieving success in shaping the rules of the road for RGGI beyond 2020 to 2030. But I'm going to focus on the first 2. Those were truly 2 of the most important ones. The reducing the emissions cap by an additional 30% from 2020 to 2030 was a critical component. Another critical component was to add the innovative new emissions containment reserve, which will reduce emissions even more when it is inexpensive to do so. And then there were additional key components of discussions among the states. RGGI is so diverse in its membership that we spent quite a bit of time discussing adjustments for the bank allowance in 2020 and also improvements to the existing cost containment reserve. But detailed information on all of the planned improvements is available on RGGI's website. And I'm going to just go ahead and delve a little bit more into detail on the first 2. And if you would go to the next slide. So the stringency question and increasing the stringency of RGGI, that's what this is all about. The RGGI cap is currently scheduled to reduce by 2.5% per year until 2020. The planned improvements that we're all moving forward with is that that will extend the schedule of reductions and strengthen their pace, yielding an additional 30% reduction in the regional cap from 2020 to 2030. And the illustration tries to point out the difference here and how we are significantly reducing emissions by what we've agreed upon. Those reductions from 2020 to 2030 will be on top of the significant progress the RGGI states have already made in reducing emissions in these first 9 years of the program. By 2030, the improved RGGI cap will be 32% more stringent than the 9 states' aggregated Clean Power Plan goals were. So let's move to the next slide. And that's a little bit more detail on the emissions containment reserve, a new component and a very important and innovative component. We'll start implementing it in 2021. If allowance prices are low, indicating that the cost of reducing emissions is low, then the emissions containment reserve will automatically reduce the cap. The graph that you're looking at on the left, displays allowance prices in the 2020s. The green area represents allowance prices below the emission containment reserve's trigger price. If a quarterly auction clears at a price below that year's trigger price for the ECR, the emissions containment reserve, which would be in the green area in the graph, then the emissions containment reserve will reduce the cap for that year by withholding allowances from the quarterly auctions. The graph on the right displays the new RGGI cap, along with how much lower the cap could go in the event that the emissions containment reserve triggers. So, if an auction clears in the green price area on the left graph, then the emissions containment reserve will reduce the cap that year to a point in the green cap area on the right, potentially as low as the green line. The overall purpose of the emissions containment reserve is to take advantage of opportunities to reduce emissions even more than the new cap will, if it is inexpensive to do so. All right, next slide. New state participation. The RGGI states are always available to discuss participation with any interested states or commonwealths. We've had collaborative and productive conversations with Virginia as they develop a program that would link to RGGI. While preliminary contacts with New Jersey have been made, the RGGI states have not yet begun formal or substantive discussions. We look forward to in-depth dialogue in the near future. Whenever any new state is interested in participating in RGGI, the most important issues to discuss are how to achieve comparable stringency with the existing RGGI program and how to ensure the elements of the new state's program are consistent enough with the existing state programs for the broader market to work effectively. Thanks for your attention. I'll turn it back to you, Janet.
And we have a quick clarifying question. Someone's asking, how was the trigger prices set?
The first answer is very carefully, but the more appropriate and accurate answer in depth is through modeling. We had extensive modeling to set that trigger price.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have more for you. But at this point, let's move on to Mike. Michael, you want to step in here at this point?
Yes, thank you, Janet. I'm Mike Dowd. I am the director of the Air and Renewable Energy Division for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. And I want to thank C2ES for giving me the opportunity to talk about some what I think are exciting things going on down here in Virginia right now with respect to climate and potential linking to RGGI. I'll just give a little background first. Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe was a big fan of the Clean Power Plan because he saw it as a way to limit carbon emissions while at the same time boosting Virginia's new energy economy. However, as most of us remember, the U.S. Supreme Court stayed implementation of the Clean Power Plan back in February of 2016. And then right after that, the Virginia General Assembly told DEQ that we couldn't spend any money implementing the Clean Power Plan during the Supreme Court stay. Well, the governor was a little miffed by the General Assembly's actions. So in June of 2016, he issued Executive Order 57, directing our Secretary of Natural Resources to convene a work group to develop recommendations to reduce Virginia's carbon emissions. The work group members included the Secretaries of Natural Resources and Trade, my boss, the DEQ director, the director of the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, and a Deputy Attorney General. Now, the work group held 6 meetings between August of 16 and March of 2017, received over 40 presentations and over 8,000 written comments. Next slide, please. The work group's report to the governor was issued on May 12, 2017. Now, its first recommendation was to establish via a regulatory process a trading-ready carbon emission reduction program for fossil fuel electric generating facilities that would enable participation in a broader established multi-state carbon market. And the report said, and I'm quoting here, there was tremendous public interest in this particular recommendation. The work group believes that it is important and necessary that Virginia work through a regional model like the established and successful RGGI in order to both achieve lower compliance costs and address the interstate nature of the electric grid. Next slide, please. Now, in the middle of the work group's proceedings, we all may recall there was a little presidential election. President Trump was elected president, and the prospects for the Clean Power Plan appeared very bleak indeed. Now, with this in mind, and wanting to move Virginia forward on the climate front, on May 16, 2017, Governor McAuliffe issued Executive Directive 11, directing the Department of Environmental Quality to develop a proposed rule under existing state law for the Virginia State Air Pollution Control Board to consider that would limit carbon emissions from electric power facilities. Now, the proposed rule had to contain provisions to ensure that Virginia's regulation was trading ready to allow for the use of market-based mechanisms in the trading of carbon dioxide allowances through a multi-state trading program. Now, Although Executive Directive 11 does not explicitly mention RGGI, if you look around for existing carbon trading programs, RGGI is the only game in town. So it was the clear intent of Executive Directive 11 for DEQ to develop a carbon rule that is linkable to the RGGI program. Next slide, please. Now, following extensive public process and discussions with RGGI states, DEQ in November presented to the State Air Pollution Control Board a draft RGGI linkable carbon trading rule affecting new and existing fossil fuel electric generating facilities. Now, I want to say here that there were sort of two balls up in the air at the same time during this process. While we were developing the rule here at the state level and with stakeholders, we at DEQ and folks in the governor's office were also engaged in discussions with RGGI states going back several months, because the last thing we would want to do would be to develop a rule, present a rule to our Air Pollution Control Board that would, shall we say, not be linkable to RGGI or be dead on arrival with the RGGI states. I think those talks went well. Because basically our proposal, the one we presented to the Air Board, was based on the August 2017 RGGI model rule that you heard Secretary Grumbles discuss a second ago. It includes provisions for the 3% annual declining CO2 budget, the cost containment reserve, emission containment reserve, and midterm bank adjustments. Now, our proposal rule also has a set-aside consisting of 5% of our annual CO2 budget to be administered by the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy for the purpose of promoting energy efficiency and further carbon reductions. Now, the biggest difference between the Virginia rule and what all the other RGGI states do is that Virginia will not be directly auctioning allowances, but instead will allocate allowances to sources based on electric generating output, with a required consignment of those allocated allowances to the RGGI quarterly auction. Next slide, please. And just I'll briefly discuss how the consignment auction approach works. It sort of goes like this. Conditional allowances will be allocated by DEQ to budget sources on the basis of electric generating output. Budget sources are then required to consign all of their conditional allowances to the RGGI quarterly auctions. Budget sources then purchase all of the allowances they need for compliance at the RGGI auctions or in the secondary market. And one thing to keep in mind is that conditional allowances cannot be used for compliance purposes by the covered sources. Now, however, the money raised at auctions from the sale of a budget source's consigned conditional allowances will be returned to the budget source by the auctioneer at the clearance price. Now, you have to keep in mind that Virginia electric utilities are regulated by the State Corporation Commission. We're a regulated state, and that's somewhat different than I think perhaps all the other RGGI states. So the money received by budget sources that are owned by regulated electric utilities should flow to ratepayers pursuant to State Corporation Commission requirements, thereby mitigating program costs to consumers here in Virginia. The next slide. And now I'll just let me conclude with our path forward. The Virginia State Air Pollution Control Board approved the proposed rule for public comment at its November meeting. A formal 90-day public comment period started this Monday on January 8th. There are some issues. The key issues remaining to be addressed in the final rule include the size of the initial 2020 CO2 budget, the industrial exemption, and the treatment of biomass. Now, Virginia continues to talk with RGGI states to assure that our final rule conforms sufficiently with the RGGI program to be acceptable to the RGGI states. And believe me, when you're talking about a 50 or 60, 70 page regulation that we're trying to vet as closely as possible to RGGI, there are going to be some word differences, and we're working through that right now with our RGGI counterparts. And at this point, I believe those talks are going well, and I have no reason to think that that there are going to be any insurmountable obstacles going forward. Now, DEQ, we will present a final rule to our Air Board for consideration later this year. We don't know the exact timing on it, but I would guess sometime in the summer or late summer or early fall. And for further information, you can visit the Virginia Town Hall and DEQ's GHG website, both of which contain just copious amounts of information on both the proposed rule and various RGGI elements and things like that. So I'm available for questions, and thank you very much. Janet, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Mike. One quick clarifying question.
Sure.
Does Virginia's rule currently cover rural co-ops?
It would cover rural co-ops to the extent that they own or own affected sources, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
And I can discuss that more in depth later.
Okay, that sounds terrific. Now let's take a kind of a broader look at this, and we've got Virginia moving forward. We've had RGGI operational for many years now. Rob, do you want to talk a little bit about what are some of the lessons from all this activity?
I'll be happy to do that, Janet. So let me first of all join the others in saying I'm delighted to be on this webinar sponsored by C2ES. Good to be with you again, Janet, and delighted to be with Ben and Mike. So I'm in a sense taking a step back to reflect on the lessons that have been learned from what are really 30 years of experience that we've had in Europe and in the United States with cap and trade systems. I'm drawing on research and an article that I wrote together with Professor Richard Schmalensee of MIT, and at the very end I'll tell everyone on the webinar how they can get hold of that article if they would like to do so. But let me start by saying how we identified which cap and trade systems we should actually analyze. There have been dozens of emissions trading systems that have been proposed, planned, and for that matter, implemented. We selected just 7 for analysis, and to do this, we used 3 criteria. First, we focused exclusively on cap and trade mechanisms. In other words, we didn't include emission reduction credit or offset systems in our analysis. Secondly, among cap and trade mechanisms, we focused on those that address pollution abatement. So for example, we didn't include ITQ systems that are used to regulate fisheries. And then finally, we focused on what we consider to be the most prominent examples, those that are particularly important either environmentally or economically or both. So what that led to then was identifying 7 cap and trade systems for analysis. The leaded gasoline phase down from the 1980s during the Reagan administration, the SO2 allowance trading program launched during the administration of George H.W. Bush with the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, NOx trading in the eastern United States under the Clean Air Act, the regional clean air incentives market in the Los Angeles area, RGGI, of course, California's cap and trade system that started with AB 32 and now is going forward under additional authorization. And finally, the European Union emissions trading system. As you can see, the last 4 of these are ongoing. So let me go directly to the lessons. I'm going to divide them up into several categories. And the first category are lessons regarding the basics of a cap and trade system. You'll notice that after each one of the lessons, you'll see in hard brackets a reference to specific systems. That's just saying which of the systems produced the given lesson. And I'm not going to go into the details about that, but just describe the lessons. So the first one is that cap and trade systems have long since proven to be environmentally effective and cost effective. Younger listeners on the webinar might be surprised to even talk about that, but if you go back to the 1980s and even the 1990s, there was huge skepticism regarding these approaches. Secondly, economy-wide systems, in the case of carbon dioxide, have been shown to be feasible, but downstream sectoral systems have been much more common. And in the case of CO2, downstream, midstream emissions trading has been used, not upstream carbon rights. Even though an upstream carbon rights program could be comprehensive, it has the potential to be vastly more efficient. Transactions costs have been low in most applications, particularly when the compliance entities are similar to one another, are homogeneous. Also, it's been demonstrated that it's important to avoid requirements for prior government approval of trades. That drives up transactions costs. Certainly, good monitoring and enforcement plus penalties yield high levels of compliance. In the SO2 allowance trading program, it's close to 100% compliance as a result of a very stiff penalty and 365-day-a-year, 24-hour monitoring. And lastly here, the final rules should be in place before the beginning of the first compliance period in order to avoid what otherwise would be unnecessary price volatility. So that's on the basics. Next, I'll turn to some specific elements of design and again draw on lessons from these 7 programs in our experience over the past 30 years. First is that banking has been very important economically. A large share of the gains from trade have not been from cross-sectional trading in some of the programs, but rather from banking, which I would think of as intertemporal trading. The absence of banking can lead to price spikes and to price collapses, and we've seen both of those happen. Price collars are valuable. A changing economy can render a cap non-binding. On the other hand, a changing economy can also drive prices to excessive levels. We've seen now that price collars can be made feasible via a price floor on auctions, a reservation price, and through the judicious use of an allowance reserve to form the ceiling. Finally here, constraints on offset use can lead to a thin market. There are reasons to constrain offset use if the offsets themselves might not be legitimate, but it's important to recognize this can result in ineffective cost containment if that's the purpose for the offsets in the first place. Turning from those to a very important issue, which is allowance allocation. This is a very significant distributional issue, as economists would call it. And because of that, it's very important politically. Now, we've seen that free allowances foster valuable political support at the beginning of a system, but when the allowances are given out for free, the opportunity is foregone to cut the social cost of the program by using what would be auction revenue to cut distortionary taxes. However, the empirical experience reveals that when there have been auctions, when there is revenue coming from cap and trade systems, there are strong political pressures not to use those funds to cut distortionary taxes, which would be the economist's dream, but rather to fund new or existing government programs, or in one case, to relieve deficits. The political attraction, in fact, of auctioning for most governments is the fact that they produce revenues. Empirically, globally, around the world, so not just the systems I'm looking at here, 70% of cap and trade revenue has actually been earmarked for green spending. We can contrast that with the experience with carbon taxes, where it's the opposite. 72% of carbon tax revenue has been refunded or dedicated to general funds. So that's on allowance allocation. Now let's look at another important political issue, which is leakage and competitiveness. So a frequent political concern is emissions leakage and economic leakage, and therefore impacts potentially on jobs and related competitiveness impacts. The reality is that this can range from non-existent to potentially serious. I should say, since we're focusing on RGGI, the reason I say potentially serious is that had RGGI in its earlier periods been fully binding and seriously binding, then the best analysis says there would have been a tremendous amount of leakage, actually from New York State to Pennsylvania. However, prices were so low, RGGI was barely binding, so the leakage didn't take place. Now, this is most likely to be serious, not surprisingly, if there's a limited geographic scope of the program, and particularly in the power sector due to interconnected electricity markets, which then become essentially a vehicle for potential leakage. Now, a way in which politicians and designers have often tried to address these concerns is by giving out the allowances for free. That certainly does engender political support, and it makes the compliance entities very happy. After all, the allowances are worth thousands, hundreds of thousands, in aggregate millions of dollars. But free allocation per se does not address leakage or competitiveness, and that's because these allowance allocations are inframarginal. They don't affect marginal costs. However, an output-based updating allocation system, which was what was in the Waxman-Markey legislation that passed the House and didn't get out of the Senate at the federal level and is in the AB 32 system in California, that makes the allocations marginal. And as a result of that, it does address the competitiveness concerns. At the same time, however, because it is a production subsidy, it fundamentally is subsidizing dirty production and introduces inefficiencies of its own. So ultimately, the only way really to eliminate, if one wants to totally eliminate leakage and competitiveness risk, is of course through broadening the coalition of action, whether in the US case where there are systems only at the subnational level, bringing in more states, or beyond that, enlarging the scope internationally. Now let me turn to interactions with other policies, and again, lessons here. So even a narrow-minded neoclassical economist like myself would never say that carbon pricing is all that's needed. We would say that it's necessary for a variety of reasons. Carbon pricing is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the reason is that there are other market failures other than the climate change environmental market failure. One example of that is the principal agent problem that affects energy efficiency decisions in renter-occupied buildings. Another is the public good nature of information and how that provides under-incentives for basic research and development. So what that tells us is that specific non-pricing policies, such as zoning in the case of energy efficiency or certain kinds of R&D policies, can be complementary. But I want to accent can be, because in fact some complementary policies, in fact many of the types we've seen, can actually conflict rather than complement. So for example, in many cases these complementary policies have actually sought to reduce emissions from sources that are already under the cap of a cap and trade system, and cases in which one of these other market failures does not exist. The result is that rather than reducing CO2 emissions on net, these additional policies simply relocate emissions from one source to another. So there's no incremental emissions reduction. Now that's unless we're at the allowance price floor or the price ceiling, in which case the cap and trade system is acting as a carbon tax. It still leads to a lack of cost effectiveness, but you can get the additional emissions reductions. Secondly, as a result of departing from the situation in which all sources are at the same marginal cost, the abatement costs overall are driven upwards. So we've got no incremental CO2 emissions reductions. We've done nothing for CO2 through the complementary or so-called complementary policy. We're driving up abatement costs. And then worse yet, number three, is that because the overall demand for allowances has been reduced, so the allowance price is suppressed. And therefore we get all the hand-wringing in the EU ETS or in California regarding a lack of incentives for technological change. So some complementary policies, not all, some complementary policies have perverse effects. Now, some people have pointed out that despite these perverse effects, there may be reasons why policymakers nevertheless want to keep these complementary policies in place. And one reason would be to keep allowance prices low by having the other policies do the heavy lifting. Now, why would that be? Well, that's because the costs of addressing the problem are obvious in the case of a carbon tax or in the case of a cap and trade system. The costs are even greater with these complementary policies, but the costs are often hidden, and so they hold a political attraction. So those are the set of lessons that we've isolated. Let me conclude by saying that Clearly China, which, as you know, on December 19th, 2017, announced the beginning of a period of development of a national cap and trade system, beginning with the electricity sector and then spreading into other sectors. And other countries around the world, for that matter, are planning to launch cap and trade systems, typically as part of their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Climate Agreement. 30 years of experience with emissions trading in the United States and in Europe offers some valuable lessons, not only lessons from the successes, but importantly also lessons from the failures, from the problems. Careful design of carbon markets in real world political context really does matter. So what to make of these lessons? Well, our view is that converting the lessons from experience in the USA and Europe to specific design recommendations for other jurisdictions, for new jurisdictions, requires both familiarity with the planned design of that new system, but importantly also an understanding of the broader economic and political context in those other jurisdictions. So we leave it to colleagues in other countries and other jurisdictions to adapt and adopt any lessons that they may judge may be relevant for the design of their systems. A picture at the lower right there is a copy of the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy, an academic journal in which the article with Dick Schmalensee appeared. It didn't appear in the issue there, which is quite old. It appeared in 2017. And let me tell you finally, to wrap up, how you can get a copy of that. For more information in general, the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, which I direct, there's the website. The Harvard Environmental Economics Program, which I also have the privilege of directing, is the website. Or you can go to my own website, and if you do, everything that I've written, just like other academics, since I was in kindergarten, is available as a PDF file for free downloading. And if you're interested, subscribe to my blog where I write much briefer essays about once a month or so. And as my children would want me to say, you can also follow me on Twitter. I believe we can also probably make available to any of the webinar participants a copy of the article. But if you can't find it at one of these websites, just shoot me an email and I will be happy to send it to you, plus other related documents. So with that, I'll close. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll turn it back to Janet.
Very good, Rob. Just a couple clarifying questions that have come in. When you think about competing and complementary policies and thinking specifically about energy efficiency, the question basically is, do we need to fund energy efficiency if we have cap and trade programs?
So that's a good question. So energy efficiency programs that are quite aggressive, both, as you know, in California and also in the European Union, are one of the reasons why there have been some perverse interactions. However, it's important to recognize that there are other market failures that have resulted in what people refer to frequently as the energy paradox, or the energy efficiency gap. That is technologies that would appear to pay for themselves in terms of their future energy savings against their upfront costs are nevertheless not adopted. And there are a whole series of market failures and other reasons, behavioral failures, that have brought that about. So the bottom line is that this is not an argument against all energy efficiency policies. Depending upon the nature of those energy efficiency policies, it can still be legitimate to have those, even if they're affecting sources that are under the cap. And I should say, which is not to toot my own horn, but just if there's interest in this, in an article that just appeared in the Journal of Economic Literature, also available from these websites, together with Richard Newell, president of Resources for the Future, and a PhD student of mine, Todd Girardin, we just wrote up a long article that's available on that very, very topic.
On energy efficiency and
on the energy efficiency paradox.
Interesting. One last question, and I'm not sure if this is clarifying or maybe more to get you to kind of elaborate on one other issue. And we often hear, cap and trade, and then there's all these belts and suspenders programs. But can you talk a little bit about what other policies you've seen that are directly conflicting with a cap and trade program?
So renewable policies that explicitly encourage renewables per se will conflict with a cap and trade program if the cap and trade program is including electricity generation, and presumably that's what the renewables policy is doing. The cap and trade system itself is already going to be bringing about a situation in which the right amount of renewables vis-a-vis others in terms of marginal abatement costs of CO2 emissions reductions are being included. What the renewables policy can do is one of two things. Either it can be irrelevant, in other words, it doesn't accomplish anything, the cap and trade system is doing the work, or it can get even more reductions in the electricity sector than there would otherwise have been. That's possible that you can get more renewables, but what is the electricity sector going to do? Well, it now has allowances that it no longer needs, and it's going to sell those off to other sectors. So you get this 100% emissions leakage. So that's the sort of thing we see in California, where there's an economy-wide or virtually economy-wide program with that kind of complementary policy.
So the conflicting nature is basically that you don't get any additional emission reductions from that policy mechanism.
That's correct. To be completely honest, we should recognize that you could get reductions in a correlated pollutant, but not in CO2.
Okay. Okay, very good. A couple clarifying questions for Ben and for Mike. Let's start with Mike. People are asking about what's the timeline for the final rule?
Well, the timeline is we're in a public comment process now that'll go through January, February, March, April. We'll have to go through the comments. We're meeting with groups right now. We had a delegation of 14 stakeholders come in yesterday. Once the public comment period is over, we will digest the comments and we will prepare a final rule. We'll also be talking to RGGI, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure our rules comport. We don't want to prepare a final rule that's not
you're breaking up a little bit.
Let me get closer to the mic. We don't want to prepare a final rule that's not acceptable to RGGI, but we hope we can certainly do that before we get a final rule together. So I think we'll be able to get a final rule together sometime before, I would say in mid-year, depending on, God, I hate to never say never because you don't know what obstacles come up or things, what you get in the middle of these processes. But if all goes according to plan, we should have a rule to the State Air Pollution Control Board sometime in late summer, early fall, and we would expect it to be promulgated at this point in time. Now, my prognostication wouldn't have been quite as solid before the election, but the opponents of climate change did suffer a somewhat defeat in our General Assembly elections back in November. So okay. Our rule stands on stronger ground than it did before.
Okay, very good. Let's see, two more for you, Mike. You talked about biomass being an issue. Can you elaborate a little bit on what the biomass issues are?
Oh, sure. It's whether we should include, we should regulate biomass emissions in our program or not. Most NGOs are dead set against it, and most industrial sources, in particular the paper industry, are very, very, very strongly favor excluding biomass, if not giving it an exemption on their argument that it's carbon neutral. It was not a huge issue when we were developing our proposed regulation. It was brought up in our stakeholder meetings, but it wasn't the principal issue. But I think it's going to be a much bigger issue as we go forward. One of our intents is to conform our rule as closely to RGGI as possible, and I'm not sure the Reggie states themselves are of one mind on how to treat biomass. So we may be on our own on this one, and it'll just be some policy calls that we'll have to make as we go forward.
Very good. I know that biomass is always an issue that comes up in these programs. We have one last clarifying question for you, and it comes back to allocation. And I'm sure that you've done modeling, analytical work to look at, various kind of options for your program. So the question is, you're not directly allocating the allowances to emitters. You're giving the value to emitters.
Well, that's correct. That's correct. We're giving them to we're allocating them to covered sources on the basis of output, and it'll be an output updating system. Professor Stavins was mentioning before. So that's what we will be doing, allocating them. They have to consign their allowances to the Reggie auction, but they are in turn, reimbursed for that. The thinking here is that we're not really giving them to the covered sources, and nearly in just about all the cases, if the source is owned by a regulated utility, then that revenue is then subject to the to rulings of our State Corporation Commission. And theoretically, the way it's supposed to work is that those revenues to regulated utilities flowing from the consigned allowances would flow back to the ratepayers, thereby mitigating the cost of compliance to consumers.
Protecting ratepayers, I get it.
Yes.
Did you look at, when you were thinking about different options, what the impacts on cost or emission reductions would have been with or without this type of allocation?
Well, let me first. I want to know. I mean, we did not look at the differences between an auction approach like the other Reggie states have and the allocation method we have. The reason we have to go to an allocation method and we can't directly auction the allowances is because if we could not do an auction approach like the other Reggie states without going to our General Assembly for approval, and at least up until November, that was a very, very remote possibility. So we had to do everything. The whole point of the rule was to do it within the existing state authority of DEQ and the State Air Pollution Control Board. So we did not look at the difference between an allocation and an auction. We did look at various allocation methods. That's true, and they were thoroughly hashed out in our stakeholder group. At the end of the day, we went with an updating output-based system, basically because of what Professor Stavins was talking about. We're aware that does, we believe it mitigates leakage, which was a concern, especially to our big utility, Dominion. So, and again, it's a proposed rule, so we are certainly open to comments during the comment period. We're not necessarily wedded to that approach. We thought it was the best approach going forward. But as I said, nothing's written in stone yet, and we will be looking at the public comments.
Good reminder that the rule is not final yet. Thank you. Hey, Ben, a question to you now, a clarifying question. And this is about the emissions containment reserve. And so the question is, does the reserve change the goal? So once the cap is lowered, does it go back up the next year? So does it change the goal using this emissions containment reserve? And is the cap lowered? And the cap is lowered, but does it go back up the next year?
The answer is yes. It would change the goal through adaptive management. That's the whole key to the ECR.
Okay. And are the emissions containment reserve allowances, are those retired, or are they put back in?
They're retired.
Okay, very good. That's the extent of the clarifying questions. And then we have lots of questions from the audience as well that are more broad-based. So let's see, we're doing this in real time, and I appreciate everybody sending in their questions. There is one more question for Virginia, and Ben, I think you can jump in on this one as well. Have there been there been discussions about expanding the scope of RGGI to be more economy-wide? You know, expanding the scope to include other sectors beyond just electricity?
Well, from Virginia's perspective, no. Our goal was to mirror RGGI, and RGGI is focused on fossil fuel generation. So are we. As time goes forward, you know, if we link to RGGI, we will certainly be, you know, hopefully at the RGGI table. And as discussions might move forward in that bent over the next few years, you know, who knows what the future holds. But no, we did not consider that because our goal was to mirror RGGI at the moment.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Ben, have you heard of discussions about expanding RGGI?
Yeah, well, RGGI is certainly focused on the power sector, and we defer to each state, flexibility and autonomy of each state to approach environmental progress, sector by sector approaches each state would. Many of the states are in discussions and part of the Transportation and Climate Initiative, but that is separate and apart from RGGI.
Yes. So let's see. Now going to some of these questions that other folks are sending in. And maybe this is best for you, Ben. You think there's any possibility that Pennsylvania is going to join RGGI? And wouldn't that help with some of the leakage issues that Rob talked about?
Thanks, Janet. Well,
What do you
we
think?
certainly have discussions with Pennsylvania, and I, you know, as a neighboring state, Maryland discusses air and climate and Chesapeake Bay issues with Pennsylvania all the time. It certainly would help on the leakage front, but it's also it's something that we're focused on right now, providing information to and working with Virginia, and we look forward to discussions, more in-depth discussions with New Jersey. We will always provide information to states that might be interested in participating in RGGI, and that would certainly include Pennsylvania.
Very good. You know, if Pennsylvania and Virginia and who knows, maybe New Jersey, all join RGGI, that's going to significantly expand the size of the cap and trade market. Is anybody concerned about increasing the size? And I'm going to open this up to you as well, Rob.
Well, in terms of expanding the size of the market, whether it's through linkage or it's another state, Virginia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, whatever, joining it, the effects of that, alas, depend. They depend upon the specific situation, not only upon the design of the new systems, but rather think about the following, is that when another state joins, the supply of allowances has increased. So you think, oh, downward pressure on price, but also the demand for allowances increases, upward pressure on price. So it's indeterminate, because what it really depends upon are the relative supply and demand functions. And put in common English, what it depends upon is the stringency of the new state compared to the stringency in the existing states, and the marginal abatement costs in the new state compared to the marginal costs in the existing states. So the prices could go up, prices could go down. It's really indeterminate. It'll depend upon specifics.
And there is, just to add my own 2 cents here, there are, you know, I guess there's quite a few studies out there that talk about the bigger the market, the more opportunities for low cost reduction. So maybe that's there too. What do you think?
Oh, so that's absolutely the case, that the larger the market, the better functioning the market is going to be, because it's going to be more robust. In particular, also, in what are concerns in many parts of the world, it's going to reduce the possibilities of any individual firm exercising market power because of the fact that the market is larger. With a larger market, there is going to be less price volatility, because if it turns out that bad weather is affecting one area, then that can be compensated for by another area in terms of supply and demand for allowances. However, again, we should also recognize that when we link systems together, in addition to reducing overall price volatility, it means that price volatility will be transmitted from one jurisdiction to another if they're linked.
True, very true. You know, at C2ES and back even when we were Pew, we used to say, well, we like an economy-wide cap and trade because of all the reasons that you just went through, Rob. And over the last few years, you know, we saw the Clean Power Plan try to develop, maybe not an economy-wide, but at least a potential for having a market, maybe market-based approach, maybe, give the states the flexibility to do that if they wanted to, doing a market-based program to control greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity sector. But we all know on this call that I think it's pretty safe to say that the Clean Power Plan in its current form anyway is going away. You know, Ben or Mike, do you think that the status of the Clean Power Plan has any implications for either RGGI or Virginia's decision to move forward? I know both of you mentioned the Clean Power Plan in your remarks.
Well, let me go first here in Virginia. Certainly, the prospective demise of the Clean Power Plan was perhaps the biggest motivating factor for our governor to say, hey, we got to get out there and do something. You know, let's go try to link with RGGI. Let's get involved in a trading program because there's not going to be a national program for a while. So certainly for us, it was a motivating factor, I would say, Janet.
Ben, do you think it has any implications for RGGI?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that RGGI's been generating benefit for the region's environment and economy since before the Clean Power Plan was proposed, and it will continue to do so if the Clean Power Plan is repealed or blocked legally. And you know, just from a Maryland perspective, I would just say that we absolutely need federal action to supplement the state and regional leadership demonstrated by the RGGI states. But I think the key message from a RGGI perspective is a federal driver can help us to broaden the size of the market, and that can increase efficiencies and reduce leakage concerns. But whether the Clean Power Plan is repealed or not, RGGI is continuing to build a very strong foundation for continued success among states, and we're enthused about sharing information with new states that are interested in participating in RGGI.
So just building on that real quick, Ben, I have a couple questions for you. So if a new state wanted to join RGGI, I mean, we know Virginia's kind of got it started here. How does a new state actually join RGGI? Anyway, can you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. RGGI states are always available to discuss participation with any interested state. So the first step is opening up a dialogue. And then in order to participate, a state would promulgate a regulatory program that is consistent with the RGGI model rule and establish a state-level allowance budget that is of comparable stringency to the caps already in place in the RGGI participating states. But the first step is engaging in discussions with RGGI, which focus on stringency and consistency of program elements. Might get into discussions about the details of governance and the specifics of participation, but opening the dialogue with RGGI Inc. and its participating states is the first step.
Sounds like folks should just follow along with what Virginia's been doing. It sounds like they've been doing all that.
We applaud Virginia for doing the work they're doing and continuing to work at it, and very, very interested in continuing the dialogue and doing what we can to help Virginia get to the point of participation in RGGI.
You know, a few years ago, I spoke to the executive director of RGGI Inc., and they were talking about one of the best things they did when RGGI was designed was put in these planned program reviews. And so now you've had two of them. You had one in 2012, and you just finished one. Now, Rob talked about all the different lessons from all the different cap and trades, but maybe you could talk a little bit about, you know, what's been learned from some of these program reviews so far, and maybe even talk about when the next program review is going to happen.
Sure. And the first thing I learned as a state environmental secretary participating in RGGI, I do it along in Maryland along with the chairman of the Public Service Commission, Kevin Hughes. But the basic point is this: regular program review is one of the most important aspects of RGGI. Reconvening to assess progress and plan for the future allows us to respond to unforeseen changes and ensures that the program remains effective. So we will begin the next program review in 2021.
Oh, very good. Seems like one of the major changes that was put into place after this last review was the emissions containment reserve, the price containment reserve. I know there was price triggers from before, but I mean, Rob, you talked about these different elements of cap and trade, different design elements. How important do you think a price collar is for programs that are getting started, cap and trade programs specifically?
So I think that the history of cap and trade systems around the world indicates that a price collar is very important. And I say this because that is a way, if one is the least bit risk averse, that is a way of reducing the possibility of absurd price spikes when some kind of an emergency takes place. We obviously saw that in Southern California with the Reclaim program, and also means you can prevent the price from dropping through what might be considered to be a reasonable floor. So a price collar makes a great deal of sense, and there have been problems in systems when there were not price collars. Interestingly enough, the system that is under development in China, it looks like they will have something like a price collar, although there are still many, many questions regarding that.
And I've heard Europeans talk about looking at the price floor in RGGI as, oh, that really was important to keep that program going. So I think that lesson is being shared pretty broadly.
Yeah. So.
Oh, sorry, Rob. Go ahead.
What I was going to say, so that what you said is true. In Europe, there was they faced a different constraint, and that is the same reason that they didn't use an upstream system of carbon rights, even though that would be efficient and economy-wide, as opposed to the 50% of the economy that they cover with their system, is the same reason why, in effect, they do not want to have a price cap, or what used to be called a safety valve, because then it looks like a tax. And this is similar to what we were just hearing in regards to Maryland. And that is, in the European Union, if something is interpreted to be a tax, then it requires unanimity in the Council of Nations, which of course is utterly impossible with the Central and Eastern European countries who would object, in particular Poland.
Yeah, it's the politics are important to getting these programs actually implemented. And thinking about just implementing a new program, and Virginia's quite a ways along now in thinking about how to do it. But Rob, have you thought about any kind of prerequisite policies that you need before you start a cap and trade program for CO2?
So I think what's probably most important is to recognize that a cap and trade system is not deregulation, it is re-regulation. So many of the requirements that need to be there for environmental integrity remain with cap and trade, in particular monitoring and enforcement. You know, as I mentioned in my presentation, the SO2 allowance trading program has, as you know, continuous emissions monitoring from the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which is why we now have continuous emissions monitoring for CO2 by coincidence, because of that 1990 requirement. So monitoring and enforcement is very important. The challenge somewhere like China, for example, will be precisely that. So that would be one. The other that I would highlight among many would be to watch out for pre-existing policies that will lead to perverse interactions. because the reality is that many of these other policies have already been there. Renewable policies, are almost throughout the United States. We have renewable policies now at the state level, energy efficiency programs, whole sets of command and control policies, and some of these will perversely interact, and it's very difficult to eliminate them because they typically have very strong constituencies, which is why they're there in the first place.
Very good. And I know we have a map on our website, and the map keeps getting fuller by the day about how many states actually have renewable portfolio standards.
Right.
And I think at this point we're counting up to 20. So that's a pretty good chunk of the U.S. So another question for you, Rob. Do you think? Well, let me put it this way. What evidence do you see that aggressive climate policies are boosting economic competitiveness? Do you see any evidence of that?
So, from my perspective, I think what's important to recognize is that there are reasons for addressing climate change. Some of them are ones which will see the benefits in the market, such as protecting agriculture, which will largely be in developing countries, less so in the industrialized world. And then there's the cost side, that there are both of these. And the reason to put in place a market-based program is not that the program itself is somehow going to boost the economy, but that it is going to result in the costs of the program being less than they otherwise would be. Now, I know that kind of thinking is anathema to elected officials, and if I were an elected official, I'd probably react the same and want to talk about win-win and there are no losers, but that isn't the reality. Climate policies are legitimate if the benefits are greater than the costs. I think they are globally, but there are costs, and it's in the interest to lessen those costs. A cap and trade system or a carbon tax, in other words, a market-based approach, will make the costs less, and therefore the net benefits minus costs, greater than they otherwise would be.
And I'll just add to that the question isn't whether there are any costs, because not addressing climate change also has a cost. So that comes back to the benefits should equal the cost. I completely agree. But I think sometimes we forget that not doing anything has a cost too.
Oh, those are absolutely. I mean, the benefits of environmental protection are the value of the damages that are thereby avoided. And the damages of climate change would be, and for that matter will be, no matter what happens, significant.
Yeah, I completely agree. So let's talk about why we all think RGGI is a success, and how we know RGGI has been a success. Maybe Ben, you had that nice chart, but how much have emissions gone down, and how do we know that the carbon price has done the work instead of, say, low price natural gas? Do we know that?
They both have. The tracking we've done indicates that they both have.
Okay. And maybe RGGI's cap ensures that it doesn't go back up.
Yes, I think so. One of the things that is a real strength of RGGI is that we do commission various studies and regular modeling on impacts and results to date, and including independent peer-reviewed studies on the role that RGGI plays in power sector in reducing carbon pollution from the power sector, and the potential in public health benefits of RGGI as well. And
right.
And it reinforces for many of us not just the benefits of action and managing the costs of action, but also underscores for us the costs of inaction, and gives participating states real pause to think what would be happening if we weren't engaged in a cap and trade or as we like to say, cap and invest program in our power sector.
Yeah, I love
levels
that.
of pollution, and also the funds that are being used for state-by-state investment in energy efficiency and other consumer benefits.
What did you say? $2.8 billion has been raised? I think that's pretty significant.
Yes, it is. Absolutely.
You know, so I think that the best research that's been done would indicate that the reason for the fall in CO2 emissions in the Northeast and Middle Atlantic states is fundamentally the combination of decreased natural gas prices, economic recession in an earlier period, and some favorable weather that also took place in an earlier period. That's what drove down emissions. That doesn't mean that there aren't benefits of the RGGI program. Number one is that the program is now in place, and if the cap indeed is brought down below what baseline emissions will be, and to me that's an open question because we have to see what's going to happen with gas prices, et cetera, then it may become very important in the future. But even before that, it's already done two things. One is what the others have mentioned, namely raising several $billions, as documented. Sue Tierney and a group did a very nice study for RGGI, looking at the amount of revenue raised and what was done with it. But the other is that it's become a model, because RGGI included auctioning. Originally, I think it was a requirement that 50% have to have been auctioned. We were close to 100%. There was a lot of resistance against auctioning in California, as you probably know. Certainly there is in the European Union. And RGGI provided an existence proof. It demonstrated that allowances could be auctioned. And that's very important, not just because of raising the revenue, but because, as Janet knows well, because raising that revenue means that you can lower the overall cost of the program by swapping out highly distortionary taxes, like taxes on income and investment. And at the federal level, if there is at some point going to be either an economy-wide cap and trade system or an economy-wide carbon tax, that's probably politically the only way it's going to happen, is by doing it simultaneously with cutting existing taxes. So absolutely. I think RGGI deserves thanks for that.
I think there's a lot of things we can point to that RGGI has done that others are looking and emulating, and it to me, it really does prove the point that you can raise revenue and not crater the economy, and you can get political buy-in across the spectrum. You got 11 states now working on this, plus several states that are actually talking about joining, and I think that's encouraging. Hey, Mike, I want you to get into this conversation, and maybe this is a hard question, so sorry about that, but there's some concern that if you don't take Virginia joining RGGI, if you don't take it to the General Assembly, is there any danger to the market that comes from having kind of the potential for legal challenge in Virginia? Is there any I guess legal uncertainty that would impact the market by not taking it to the General Assembly?
But by not taking it, well, I think if we took it to the General Assembly, the odds of getting a favorable result for joining RGGI are probably, even in the new political climate, are probably relatively slim. We think we wouldn't have presented a rule to the Air Board if we didn't think we had the authority. The administration wouldn't have done it. The new administration wouldn't do it. Mm-hmm. I would suspect that we're going to get sued regardless. And I would expect those cases to be resolved relatively quickly. Remember, under our rule, we wouldn't join RGGI until 2020. And, if a lawsuit is brought today challenging our legal authority, I would expect that would be resolved by the time we, joined RGGI. I would expect that there is some legal uncertainty going forward, although we think we have a much stronger case, and I would think that the market will take that into account as we go forward, and hopefully that'll all be resolved by 2020.
So Mike said something very important regarding to the uncertainty that's brought about by potential litigation, is that we observed that in California. Remember, the California program was under tremendous threat from state and federal courts because of the claim that the auction itself was illegal because there had not been a supermajority originally voting through AB 32. That suppressed the demand for allowances in the out years. Once that was resolved, as it was favorably to AB 32 recently, then we saw increase in demand for allowances. So as Mike mentioned, litigation and the uncertainty that is thereby engendered definitely affects the market.
Absolutely. I mean, these are created markets that we create by legislation. So any kind of uncertainty makes your participants just skeptical. So having some certainty, I mean, you're never going to have complete certainty, but the more certainty you can have in a market, the better. And, you know, I guess I have to just say to Mike's point, isn't every major piece of environmental legislation litigated in some way, shape, or form?
Certainly, I agree with that. And in Virginia's case with the clean, with going forward with RGGI, if we didn't do what we did, we would have nothing. So we'll go forward with the risk of uncertainty that I think there is a risk of uncertainty, but I think we're ultimately going to prevail on that. In the balance of everything, we think that was a smarter decision, a wiser decision to move forward, get that resolved, and then move forward after that. As I said, hopefully it'll be resolved by 2020 before we actually will be linking up to RGGI. But we really had no choice.
Right, and I do see stakeholders getting increasingly involved and pushing for action, and even taking states to court over that. And we'll see where that goes in the long run. But I think there is a danger of not doing anything. And so I guess you can't get away from complete uncertainty in these created markets, but you do what you can. And I can't tell you, Mike, how excited we are that Virginia is going forward in this and taking the step to join RGGI, and how excited we are that RGGI itself is actually potentially expanding with a few new states. Here at C2ES, we're pretty excited, and I'm sure other folks on the phone are as well. I want to thank everybody again for joining today's webinar, and I really want to thank our speakers for helping to make this a really terrific webinar. We've got a couple handouts that are in the control box. I think that's what it's called. And this webinar will be put on our website. And before I let you guys go, C2ES, we do these webinars, and we have several more planned in coming months. We're going to do one on resilient infrastructure, electric vehicles, and school buses. There's a lot of interest in tax reform and the extenders, so we'll do one on that. And all these webinars, including this webinar, will be posted on our website, c2es.org. So thank you again. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Rob. Really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you that have tuned in to this webinar. Look forward to having you again, and I hope everyone has a great day. Take care now.